Hello, and welcome back to the second episode of the Mentor's Blueprint. Today, I'd like to welcome a special guest, Timothy Harkness. Tim Harkness is a South African psychologist and sports scientist with extensive experience working with elite athletes across various sports, including rugby, football, and Olympic disciplines. He spent 14 years as head of the sports science and psychology at Chelsea Football Club, and now works in Saudi Pro League in sporting affairs. Known for his expertise in communication, decision making, and mental strength, Tim has also authored works and spoken extensively about these topics. Tim, thank you so much for being on the Mentors Blueprint. It's great to have you here. Why don't you start with talking a little bit about your background, your family, where you're from, and how you grew up?
So I grew up in South Africa, and for somebody of my age, what is relevant as a South African is that we grew up under a political system called apartheid and moved out of that system peacefully in the mid-90s as I was becoming an adult. So that's really where I'm from, and a significant experience in my life. Got married in South Africa, had 3 children in South Africa, then moved to the United Kingdom, spent 15 years there, and currently live in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh.
Awesome. So you've guided athletes across a wide range of sports, but you're also an athlete yourself, having tried your hand at everything from sailing to cycling and playing squash most of your life, like me. So, what have been some of your biggest personal learnings as an athlete?
What I was saying is that, first of all, I stress I'm an amateur athlete. And part of accepting that you're an amateur athlete is accepting that participating is more important than the level that you achieve. So I've always enjoyed competition, and I've competed as an amateur athlete for over 40 years. And I think in order to be a successful competitor for that long, you can't afford to take it that seriously. So you've got to be able to accept winning and losing. And something I used to say to professional footballers that I worked with was, I probably lost more matches than any of you, just because I've been doing it for a long time and I've been doing it at an amateur level. So I think that probably would be the one. And then I think the other, and this again is something I learned from football, is I used to watch footballers who, compared to some training regimes, didn't train very hard. So, if you take a cyclist has a brutally hard training regime, or a swimmer, they train incredibly hard. Footballers don't always train incredibly hard, but they train almost every single day. And that is a piece of advice that I would give to people, is that you don't always have to go hard, but persistence and consistency is extremely important.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think that a lot of people in our audience are in high school and they have to make the decision between pursuing a sport full time or focusing more on academics. So understanding how to play a sport as an amateur and not be too caught up by the intensity of your training or the result is really important. When I coach younger bridge players in my school, I find that my own experiences at the table, both the triumphs and setbacks, really shape the way I help them. How have your experiences as a sports person shaped the way you support and guide other athletes?
Maybe we have slightly different experiences here, because you have competed in bridge at an elite level, whereas I haven't competed in sport at an elite level. I might have played a squash match in front of 2 of my friends and my opponent's parents, but that doesn't really relate that well to a footballer playing in front of 50,000 people, for example. So I think really I probably learned more from listening to athletes and hearing them explain the experience and hearing them explain what succeeded and what failed. And one of the privileges that I've had is worked with athletes who've really been at the very top of their sports. And these athletes are sometimes very confident in their approaches. And one athlete said to me once, when we're under pressure, we know what to do because we've done it before and it worked. And when you have that level of confidence in your methodology, it's something I have been able to hopefully learn from and then pass it on to other players.
Understood. That's incredible. Are there any anecdotes that you can share with us from great players that have helped, shape the way you counsel other athletes?
Well, I think if I was to say the one player that I've spent a lot of time with is the goalkeeper, Petr Cech. One of the first things he ever said to me is for him, the score is always 0-0. He started telling himself that when he was 12 or 13 years old, because he used to find that he would get anxious before a match because he was worried about the result. And eventually he started to say to himself, the score is always 0-0. And as it happened, the first year that I worked with Chelsea Football Club, the last match of the season, if we won that match, we were going to win the league. And Petr Cech, if he kept what in goalkeeping terms is called a clean sheet, so if the opponent did not score against us, he would get the Golden Gloves Award, which is a very prestigious goalkeeping award. He had already said to me, because the score for him is always 0-0, he never celebrates a goal when we score. And I was watching this final match of the season. I was sitting in the stand right behind him. And it was a tense match, and we had to win it to win the league. And we played and played and played, and eventually we scored a goal. And I thought to myself, well, now we'll see if you practice what you preach. Because you said you never celebrate a goal, because for you the score is always 0. Let's see what happens. And we scored a goal, and he didn't celebrate at all, even though this now made it more likely that we were going to win the league. And then we played a little bit more and we scored another goal. And I thought, I can understand maybe the first one you thought, there's still some work to do. Now we scored 2, no celebration. Then we scored 3, no celebration. 4, no celebration. 5-0. Now, 5-0, we're going to win the league. We scored 5-0. He still did not celebrate. 6-0, he didn't celebrate. Then on 6-0, one of their players had a breakaway, got 1v1 with him, and he saved the goal, which meant that he won the Golden Glove. And then eventually we scored a goal for 7-0. And at 7-0, he just went like this. He went, like he didn't even smile, but he just kind of clenched his fist a tiny bit. And that was the only celebration. Because for him, it is so important that the score is always 0-0. And, one of the things I think I would say is that a lot of people feel that when you're under pressure, it's okay for you to drop your standards. But for a high performer, when you're under pressure, it's even more important that you maintain your standards. And, to have a philosophy that you always believe that the score is 0-0, even when it means winning the Premier League, or even when it means winning the Golden Glove. That I think is maybe a difference between high performers and people who don't perform at a high level.
Right. Yeah, that's incredible. In my experience playing bridge, I used to have this habit where, because especially while playing online, you can see the scores of the hands you've played previously while you're playing. And
Right.
you play about 50 hands in a day, so you can keep reviewing the boards you've played previously. I would continue ruminating about a mistake that I've made on a previous board, and that would affect my performance on the boards I played subsequently.
Yeah.
And I think that dealing with that pressure and sort of, purging the memory of each hand in my mind was really important to improving my performance because I stopped remembering what happened on the previous board and I was able to get back into the present. And I think that's helped a lot. But what would you say are some of the key traits that the key mental traits that separate good athletes from truly elite performers?
Well, when we talk about mental traits, when I work with athletes, I used to use the concept of focus, motivation, and confidence as being the 3 key mental traits. And then after I'd been using that for years, I was curious to find that the ancient Greek philosopher Plato used the concept of head, heart, and stomach. And for him, the head was intellectual abilities or focus, the heart was courage or confidence, and the stomach was desire or motivation. And the person who was writing about this said that in many cultures across history, there has been this notion of this 3-way split of mentality into broadly motivation, confidence, and focus. So I found this to be quite a useful division of mental ability, is to talk about your ability to do these three things. And then you need to have a strategy for how you're going to get yourself to focus better or get yourself to be more motivated or more confident. And then you can have individual strategies for each of those. And, you know, one very interesting one, you used the term rumination. And I think some people have brains that tend to ruminate a little bit more than other people. I'm probably one of those people, tend towards rumination. So you need to have a strategy for how you're going to manage that. And, you know, I watched my wife and I years ago, we really enjoyed the BBC TV series of Sherlock, talking about the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. And in this TV series, I've read all the books as well, just by the way, but that was a while
Same
ago.
here.
Oh, really? Brilliant. In the TV series, and I don't think the literary Sherlock Holmes uses this term, but in the TV series, the Sherlock Holmes uses the term of a mind palace. And this describes the building or the space where he can take his mind. And the notion of a mind palace is that there are many different rooms in this palace, and you can enter any of those rooms at any time. And when you're ruminating, it's like you've just got stuck in one room. And maybe that's not the room that you need to be in. And, you know, this would particularly be the case when you're competing, for example, is for sure, you know, there's a room with information about what you have done. But there's also a room with information about what you need to do now, and that's the room you need to be in. And
Sure.
the ability to control your focus is the ability to move from one room to another and be in the right room at the right time. And, you know, there would be another time where you just need to sleep, for example. You know, you don't need to be in either of those busy rooms. You just need to be in a nice, relaxing room. So I think that is a concept about the ability to control focus. But then we also have to be able to control motivation, and we have to be able to control confidence as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think what you said about the brain, the heart, and the stomach really resonates with me. In fact, Plato was actually an athlete himself. So the word Plato in Greek actually means broad. And there's a lot of historical accounts of him being this huge, imposing figure. So
Oh,
he's
wow.
not just an intellectual guy, he's really
Okay.
physically fit as well.
Oh, very
Um,
interesting. I didn't know that.
yeah, but I've seen how communication makes or breaks a partnership in bridge, where being on the same wavelength as your partner is absolutely essential. And it reminds me of stories about Michael Jordan or Phil Jackson, where their ability to communicate elevated the entire team. Your book, 10 Rules for Talking, dives deep into this topic. What inspired you to focus on communication, and how have you seen it change an athlete's performance, especially in team sports?
Well, I'm always interested in things that I'm not good at. So I wouldn't. Yes, I think as a psychologist, you know, hopefully I'm good at a certain kind of communication. But what I realized when I moved from being only a psychologist to working in a football club and working in performance more generally, is that it wasn't enough just to be good at having conversations one-on-one with people who wanted to talk to you. Because as a psychologist, that's what you do, is
Sure.
you only talk to people who want to talk to you, and it's generally one-on-one. And but that's quite a small subset of all the conversations that you're going to have in life. Because sometimes you're talking to people who don't want to talk to you, or you're talking to people who don't agree with you, and you're talking to people where maybe they want one thing and you want another thing. As a psychologist, you generally both want the same thing, which is for
Right.
the person who's come to see you to do well. You both want that. So I realized that I had to find skills that would let me perform better in a broader set of conversation situations. And that's really what led me towards writing the book. And in the book, I do try and stress that I don't consider myself to be an expert in communication, but I'm someone who's interested in it and was trying to gather my thoughts that I've had about it. So that's what
Right.
led me to it.
That's great. So in Bridge, we actually have a set of tools that are intricately developed by partnerships to communicate as much information as you can with each card you play or each bid you make. And these tools are very sophisticated. They're developed over 10, 20, 30 years by partnerships that stay together. And then there are some more general tools that can be used by anyone, even without having that discussion. But what are the kind of tools you use to communicate with sports people? And do you think that's different between communicating with a team player versus an individual sports person?
You know, an athlete that we both know is Abhinav Bindra,
Yes,
who was India's first ever individual Olympic gold medalist. And you would think 10-meter air rifle shooting is the most individual sport you can get. But Abhinav was surrounded by a team. He had people who supported him emotionally. He had people who helped him develop mental strategies. He had people who worked with him technically, worked with him physically. And the really interesting thing is that Abhinav was always the leader of his own team, and he was an extremely good leader. So even in that highly individual sport, it's actually a team sport. And
right,
then the same applies for team sports, is that they're also team sports. And then I think one of there are two rules that I came across talking about communication. They're saying in order to have successful communication, you need to have mutual respect and mutual purpose. So you both have to respect each other, and you both have to feel that you want the same thing or the same outcome. And when you have those two things, you can have a successful conversation. And I'm guessing, even in bridge, even in the heat of a competition, it's important between the two of you that there's respect. And it's also important between the two of you that there's mutual purpose. And
right.
sometimes, and the mutual purpose is that you're going to resolve the bridge problem that is sitting in front of you right now. That's the mutual purpose. It needs to be really specific, because sometimes we can lose track of the purpose. And maybe in a bad scenario, my purpose is suddenly expressing my emotions, or trying to prove that I was right, or talking about something that happened in the past. It's possible that that becomes my purpose. And if that's my purpose, but it's not your purpose, then communication is going to break down. And obviously, if there's not respect, then communication is going to break down as well. But when we've got those two things, mutual purpose, mutual respect, we can have conversations about really tough topics because we've got those two things.
Right. I think that mutual respect is often, taken as a given, and that it's necessary, but people don't talk about mutual purpose often enough. And I guess that I'm just thinking back to my experiences. A lot of partnership arguments and fights among the team could have been resolved just by thinking about what our objective was, because it often diverges from the actual goal when you're in an emotionally charged situation. I also
Absolutely.
read about your pivotal role in Abhinav Bindra's success in his autobiography. He's had one of the most incredible but tumultuous careers, and you
Yeah.
must have witnessed athletes experiencing slumps or setbacks. So, what's one approach you use to help them regain confidence? Maybe you could tell us about that with an example.
Yes. Well, you ask about confidence, and like I said, confidence, one of the big three elements of a mental strength approach. I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between mental strength and mental health, because you know Martin Seligman very well. And Martin Seligman, possibly one of the most important, well, he definitely one of the most important psychologists of the last century. And we'll talk about his approach to mental health, because what we've been discussing so far is mental strength, and mental strength is a very important topic, but we can't forget mental health, and we've got to think about how those connect together. But in terms of commitment, in terms of confidence, I would say, first of all, with confidence, I've got to understand that that there's always a probability attached to a goal. So, and ironically, because people often think that confidence is, well, I'm definitely going to do that. But
Absolutely.
ironically, when I say I'm definitely going to do that, I'm saying I'm 100% likely to achieve this. And ironically, how confident am I that I'm 100% likely to achieve this? Not very confident.
Right.
How confident am I that I'm 80% likely to achieve this? More confident. How likely am I that I'm 60% confident to achieve this? Even more confident. So, ironically, the more I accommodate probabilities and the more I move away from definite black and whites, the more confident I can become because I'm confident about being likely to achieve something. So if I actually manage the goal that I set for myself and don't say I have to win or I'm always going to win, I never lose, when I make those kinds of comments, I always win, I never lose, I make myself less confident. Whereas
Right.
if I say I win some of the time, or even I win more often than not, or I win 2 out of 3, or whatever the case may be, when I introduce a probabilistic element into my forecasts, I can become more confident that I'm going to be right. So I would say that is one element. Another element of confidence is that in some ways, confidence isn't what matters. Commitment is what matters. So if you go into a bridge tournament, it actually doesn't really matter whether you think you're going to win or not. What matters is that you commit to doing the right things. Now, sometimes, and some people can only commit when they're confident. And for me, that would be a low performance mindset. The high performer can commit even when he's not confident.
Right.
And I had this exact conversation with N'Golo Kante, who one of the greatest footballers of the last decade. And I was commenting on his ability to keep working hard even when the match was not going well. And he said to me, yes, as long as there's a probability, as long as there is a possibility, I'll still work hard. So he can commit even when he's not confident that we're going to win. And of course, that commitment makes it more likely that you're going to win. And because there are no guarantees in sport, likely that you're going to win is as good as it gets.
Right. Yeah, I think that I'm quite familiar with, dealing with these probabilities and confidence versus commitment because bridge is also a very analytical game.
Yeah.
So I've often been in situations where, my coach tells me that, I mean, you did the right thing, but it didn't succeed
Yes.
on this board because there's a lot of plays that have a certain probability of success. And like you said, maybe not the highest performing athletes will make the play that is right on a particular hand, although it's not probabilistically the right play. But you have to, I think that, analyzing your own result by the quality of your process rather than the outcome and whether I'm sticking to the percentages on every board has really helped me improve my game. I actually had an interesting experience coming into Bridge. When I started playing, I was 6.5 years old, and it's an intense game for someone that young to learn. And I had a
Mm.
really, really patient, I had an incredible coach, and he used to come home, a couple of times a week, sit with me, and spend hours just teaching me the absolute basics. And about 18 months down the line, he told my dad actually that I've taught Anshul everything I know. I think it's time for you to find a better coach, which is incredible. I mean, I didn't know about it then, but hearing about it now,
Yeah.
the humility is just outstanding. So I was curious about how you have worked most effectively with the coaches of athletes that you mentor and how communication plays a role in those dynamics.
Mm. Well, there have been many different relationships. One I can think of is I worked very closely with a golf coach. When I worked in South Africa, I worked with a lot of golfers. And we became so interested in each other's sports that sometimes the golfer would say they didn't know who was the psychologist and who was the swing coach. And you mentioned Plato being an athlete, and you were hinting at the connection between just that athletic endeavor is not something you can isolate as being purely mental or purely physical. And I think what this golf coach and I found is that you can't just talk about the swing without talking about mentality. And you can't talk about mentality without talking about the swing. So sometimes I would sit there and correct a golfer's swing. And sometimes my friend, the golf coach, would sit there and correct the way that they were thinking about it. So that was a great working relationship. And then obviously in the period of time that I worked in the English Premier League, I had the opportunity to work with coaches there. And that was very interesting because one of the roles of a football coach is to bond the team and to keep the team focused on the same things, motivated to do the same things, and confident that if they do the same things, that is their best opportunity for success. And so the coach is constantly telling the team a story about how they performed, what they're doing right, what they need to do less of, and he needs to weave in data, he needs to weave in anecdotes, incidents from this and previous matches, and stories from his own experience. And he's just telling this rolling narrative as the season unwinds. And part of my job towards the end of my time at Chelsea, when I'd accumulated experience about what made teams and individuals succeed, was to support the coach in developing the story. And that was a very interesting and rewarding aspect of the work.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, I recently watched the movie Moneyball, and there was a lot of friction in the dynamic between Brad Pitt, who was using the statistical approach, and the coach, who was, the very orthodox, old-fashioned style. And I found it interesting, and I was curious as to whether that's the case even now. But from what you're telling me, it looks like that's changed, and even most coaches are embracing this combination of stories and statistics and their own experiences.
Yes, football is very different to baseball in that it's still quite difficult to measure football. Now, people are getting better at it, and there's some really interesting work being done. But in baseball, you can measure precisely the impact of every single event. That's a lot more difficult in football.
Right.
But people are starting to develop the ability to do that. In terms of how coaches accommodate data, yes, it's probably by now fairly widespread in football. But people used to say to me years ago, "Does a coach listen to you?" And I would say to them, "The coach will listen to you if you're convincing."
Yeah.
And take on that responsibility of being persuasive and being convincing. And also, because when I joined a football club 15 years ago, there were a lot of people who were highly skeptical. But I think skepticism can be a good thing because it can force you to develop a more well-argued and a more compelling message. So I'm grateful to all of the people who were resistant to my presence because it taught me to justify my work more strongly.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great way at looking at, the friction you find in any environment as a way to test how persuasive you can become. But I think like baseball, even cricket has now become a very data-driven and analytical sport because all of the information is available. And I think we have a lot of cricket fans and aspiring cricketers in
Right.
our audience. So,
Mm.
do you have any interesting anecdotes about about any of our heroes that you've worked with in the Indian cricket scene?
Sure. Let me think. Maybe the first anecdote. I love cricket. And until I moved to Riyadh, I was still playing amateur cricket at a very, very low level, I must say, but I was still playing cricket matches. So I worked with cricket in South Africa. And I worked at a reasonably high level at provincial or state level. And then I moved to the United Kingdom and I worked in football for, 12 or 13 years. And then I got a call from the Delhi Capitals to come and work with them in the IPL. This was in 2019. And I walked out onto the pitch and they were having a net session in the middle of the pitch. So they just basically netted off the actual strip and then players were playing shots. And I was standing behind the batsman and Shreyas Iyer was batting. And I thought to myself, I do not recognize this game. I've never seen anything like this before. And it was interesting for me that in just 12 years, the sport had completely transformed itself. And it was incredibly exciting just to see what people were doing. And Shreyas, somebody ran in and he just switched to a left-handed stance and smashed a flat six into the player's
Wow.
dressing room. And, I'd never heard of that, never seen it, never imagined it. And just to see the creativity and the standards that were being set was really exciting to think that people can improve so much in a relatively short period of time.
Wow. That's absolutely incredible. And I think that the standards, especially physically for cricket and many other sports have shot up in the last 20 years. But how do you think your approach to sports psychology has evolved over the years, especially with increasing attention on mental health, with more and more athletes like Michael Phelps and Simone Biles coming out about their own mental health issues?
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I watched this documentary called The Weight of Gold recently, and it did resonate some of the feelings I had after the World Championships. I mean, even after winning, it felt like I have nowhere to go now. I mean,
Yes.
I've won gold, but what's next? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
A very important question. At Chelsea, we won the Champions League. So in club football, the Champions League is the biggest trophy you can win. And a little while after we won the Champions League, one of the players who had actually won the Champions League started to make himself not available for matches. And in football, this is considered to be just about the worst thing that you can do, is to say that you're not available for matches. And I was standing next to the coach, and we were talking about this exact situation. And a thought suddenly came to me, and I said to the coach, this is not an issue of mental strength. This is an issue of mental health. And it's an important distinction, because if somebody lacks mental strength, you are going to intervene in one way. But if they need to be supported with mental health, you're going to intervene in a completely different way. So if somebody is just not motivated enough, not focused enough, not confident enough, which are all elements for me of mental strength, you might want to push the person, you might want to encourage them, you might want to tell them to go for it, to just apply themselves and get through the job. That would be a mental strength approach. And if somebody is lacking mental strength, you really want to just drive them a little bit. But if somebody needs mental health support, driving them is the wrong thing to do.
Sure.
You're going to make the problem worse. So it's really important to understand when somebody is not performing, is this because of a mental strength issue or is it because of a mental health issue? Because you need to treat them completely separately. The other thing I would say is that sometimes the people with the most mental strength can dig themselves into the deepest mental health holes. And a story I'll tell, my mother used to tell the story about me, is that when I was young, it was impossible to lose me in the supermarket because as soon as I couldn't see my mother anymore, I'd start to cry so loudly that she could immediately find me.
Yeah.
And that is a story about a little boy who was using no mental strength. At no stage of being lost in a supermarket was I going, oh, I'm just going to be brave here and I'm going to try and sort this out, or I'm going to go looking for my mother. Those would have all been mental strength approaches.
Right.
But I just started to cry. And crying, actually, if the kid's 2 years old, is probably the best solution here. So I always think back to that, and I'm always kind of quite proud of that when I needed help, I shouted for it. And
Right.
sometimes people who are mentally strong don't call for help, or they don't think that they need help, or they don't look after themselves because they're just using mental strength. They're just using more focus, more motivation, more confidence to sort out a problem. And you can only do that for so long before you need to go back to having a foundation of mental health. Now, you have a number of accomplishments in your life and your career. And one of them is that you have a relationship with Professor Martin Seligman, who is an absolute celebrity, and anyone who's a psychologist really admires him because of the incredible work that he's done. And I think one of the reasons why Martin Seligman is such an important psychologist is that he's a research psychologist. So he asks scientific questions about the world. And in some of his books, he lists all of the big scientific questions that he's asked, and he's got a remarkable number of them. And that contrasts Martin Seligman with somebody like, just to choose a very popular name, Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud didn't ask scientific questions about the world. He just pondered. So he was really more of a philosopher than an actual scientist. And maybe even Sigmund Freud was really more of a storyteller. And some of the stories are compelling, they seem to make sense, but he never backed them up with solid research, which comes from asking lots and lots of people lots of questions. And one of the most interesting questions Martin Seligman asked thousands of people from multiple countries is, first of all, how satisfied are you with your life? And secondly, tell me about your life. Tell me what elements your life has that makes you satisfied with it. And when he processed all of this information, like a scientist does, he said there are 5 things that make somebody say that they have a satisfying life. And those 5 things are you have positive emotions, you have something called engagement, which is when you're really interested or involved in something. You have relationships, you have meaning, and you have accomplishment. So those are the
Yep.
5
PERMA.
things. That's it. PERM. So positive emotion, P, E for engagement, R for relationships, M for meaning, and A for accomplishment. And that is a very nice description of what mental health actually is. Because when you have got these 5 things, you're more likely to feel good about your life. Now, that's the one important thing to understand. The second important thing to understand is that you don't just need those 5, you need multiple sources of the 5. And because I'm South African, from Africa, in Africa we have multiple predators, and one predator that we have is a cheetah, and another predator that we have is a hyena. And a cheetah only eats fast-running antelope. A hyena eats anything. It'll eat fast-running antelope, it'll eat dead antelope, it'll eat rubbish off the rubbish dump. A hyena is unlikely to starve, but a cheetah is more likely to starve. Because if there are no fast-running antelope, the hyena is going to be okay, but the cheetah is not. And the same applies to PERMA, that we don't just need PERMA, we need multiple sources of PERMA. And one of the risks that an elite athlete can face is that elite sport becomes either the only or a very dominant source of PERMA. So a lot of your positive emotion is coming from your sport, a lot of your engagement, a lot of your relationships, a lot of your meaning, a lot of accomplishment. And that leaves you vulnerable when that source suddenly goes away. Whereas if you're more of a hyena and you've got lots of sources of positive emotion, so you've got positive emotion that comes from your sport, but you also enjoy going to school, you enjoy spending time with friends and family, you've got a hobby, you enjoy reading books, you've got lots of sources of PERMA. If one of them dries up, you've got all the other sources still to support you. And I think you could say that a hyena is very resilient in terms of their source of food. And as individuals, we want to be very resilient because we've got multiple sources of PERMA. That then creates the mental health that can support our mental strength.
Right. Yeah, I think understanding the distinction between the two is really insightful, because I don't think I or many people in our audience would have ever thought of that. But I have one last question for you today, Tim. And like you were talking about having multiple sources of PERMA, I think a lot of people my age and people watching this podcast are young athletes who are balancing their sport with school or college or just entering the professional sphere. Like you mentioned, one direction is being a storyteller like Freud, and the other is being more rigorous and scientific like Dr. Seligman. But in your experience over the past 20-30 years, what is one piece of advice that you'd give on balancing these various aspects of what you're doing, and on maintaining an effective mental approach?
Well, in the last years of my time working inside a football club, I became very involved in load management. And that is understanding how much football a footballer could play. And the way the season is structured is that there are more matches in a season than a footballer can play. It's not physically healthy to play a match every 3 or 4 days.
Sure.
But that is what television requires. So what you have to do as a football staff is you have to manage the load. And you have to work out how many football matches any individual player can play in a week, in 2 weeks, in a month, in a season, or in several seasons. And those people in the audience who watch the Premier League, for example, will know that Manchester City are doing quite badly at the moment relative to their own performance levels. One of the possible explanations is that they're just exhausted. And that exhaustion has accumulated over years. That it's not just they had a hard match last night and they're tired, but they'll rest for a couple of days and they're going to be fine. It may be that they've been working too hard for years, and that takes a long time to get over. And their exhaustion has been caused by their success, because the better you do, the more finals you get into and the more matches you play. But it's a very deep and a very significant challenge, and it's something you really want to avoid. But what it proves is that every single human being has a finite amount of energy. And that energy cannot be overcome through sheer willpower. And like I was saying about the mental strength, sometimes if you use too much mental strength, you're going to dig yourself into a hole. And that hole can be really hard to get out of, as Manchester City are finding right now. Because maybe what happened with Manchester City is that they used too much motivation, too much confidence, and they dug themselves into a hole, and they're struggling to cope with it now. And what it proves is that every single human being has limits. Now, a big part of performance is reaching those limits. And that's one of the joys of life, and it's one of the joys of being young, is that you can explore your own potential. That's a really interesting challenge that you have as a young person, is you don't know how good you can be. When you get to my age, I've got a fairly good idea of how good I can be at cycling or swimming or squash or whatever. There might be one or two little pockets that I can still explore. By and large, I know the answer to those questions. For you, as a young person, that question remains unanswered. And it's a really exciting adventure to see how hard can I work, how good can I be. But
another philosopher, sorry to interrupt, but another philosopher talking about, the physical aspect of things, Socrates said that it is a shame for man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable. And I think it resonates quite a bit with me about trying to push my physical limits and find them. Yeah.
Yes. And, I once with Petr Cech, as he was getting towards the end, I can't remember whether he was towards the end of his athletic career or at the end of his athletic career. And I said to him, do you remember when you were young and you felt like Superman? And he smiled and he said, yes. And, as two men who were past their physical peaks, we could both look back on our youth without regret, because we felt like we had maximized our youth in terms of realizing our physical potential. And absolutely, that is a wonderful journey and a tremendous excitement. And, having said that, I never thought at the age of 52, I would feel as strong and energetic and fit as I am. So that's been another pleasure is, I used to think when you were 50, you were pretty much finished. But realizing that you can actually be strong and healthy for a lot more of your life than you think it's going to be like when you're 16 years old. But I'll get back to the final point that you asked me to make, and that was that every human being has limits, and you need to learn to be good at realizing what those limits are, because if you go beyond those limits, there will be a price to pay. So you need to know when you've reached your sleep limit, your energy limit, your motivation limit, your emotion limit. You need to know what those limits are, because then you don't have to push beyond them. You know that there might be time to recover, there might be time to learn, there might be time to rest. But at the same time, when you know what those limits are, you can also be more comfortable and more confident and more determined to push up to those limits, but not beyond them.
Right. That's great, Tim. I think that our audience is going to love your insights. I had a great time speaking with you, and I think I've learned a lot from this conversation as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, and I appreciate all of your advice and great stories. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Anshul.